Hello out there. My name is Robert Snow, and I work with the great people at Touchlab. Today I'm sitting with two of them, Kevin Galligan and Jeff Namnum. Hello, Jeff.
Hey.
Hey, Kevin.
How you doing?
Great, good stuff. So the recent launch of the Touchlab Refactory has been getting the attention of quite a few engineering managers lately. And beyond the engineering value of the service, that is refining code incrementally with no disruption to workflow and no release delays, we also want to address the business value of what Refactory offers. So that's what this discussion today is about. And with that, let's get into the discussion. So starting with the first one here, the first question we have. Refactoring seems to always, almost always be a nice to do, a sort of an afterthought, a sidebar almost. Is it that it's undervalued?
I would say it's more that it's abstract. It's if you're building a product, it's one thing to say we need this feature because we're expecting this increase in revenue or users, as opposed to we should really clean up this code because it's less risky or maybe better performing or easier to move. It's hard to draw a number around that, but it's very easy to draw a number around a feature, or at least relatively so. So it's not that it's undervalued, it's just much more difficult to put a value on.
Yeah, I tend to agree, right? It's not necessarily an issue of undervaluing from the business side. It's a matter of that tyranny of the urgent, right? Feature releases, bug fixes, anything that's touching the end user and is visible, that's what captures the attention and the imagination of those stakeholders. They're always worried about keeping the ship afloat and moving things forward. So it just has to be explained to them in a way that they'll understand.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, so the thing that always seems to come up about any kind of reworking of code is whether it's worth the investment. So what's the bigger consideration for engineering managers today? Is it time or is it money?
Well, so I think that, that has to be asked in context, right? So if you have developers and they're available and time isn't really a big constraint, you're probably not listening to this or talking to us.
Right.
For most dev teams at this stage of mobile dev specifically, like what you should do isn't necessarily as unclear, or at least best practices are unclear. It's just that you have other things that need to get done, and the time is definitely going to be the big thing that's going to be sitting in front of you and the thing that you're worried about. Especially also recruiting. It's not easy to just add people to a team, and then all of that kind of falls into the bigger category of risk, right? So it's not even so much, to me, time or money as it is risk versus what you're trying to get done. So,
right. Jeff, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm with Kevin. It really is a contextual situation, right? Most responsible engineering managers already know if there's some refactoring that's needed.
Right.
And it is completely about what's happening at that organization. Right? Are they concerned about an aging code base and the effect it's going to have on recruiting and retention? Is it an issue of the fact that they know that the more this tech debt builds up, that it's going to affect their release velocity down the line? Right? Do they have a mandate to reduce overhead and reduce cost? So it really is entirely based on the context of that engineering manager.
Understood. So. Well, if we're looking at cost, in terms of cost, how much of an investment is refactoring?
Well,
again, it's contextual. I understand.
No, yes and no. I mean, I guess it depends how you look at it, right? So, a developer's time, whether it's from our team or your team, I mean, they're kind of not necessarily the same, but they're comparable, right? You need at least some senior hands. Perhaps they can lead a team of more junior developers. That's fine, but time is kind of time. What's not really considered really is the other dimensions, right? So building new product takes a lot of direct communication with stakeholders, a lot of trial and error. We all know what Agile is at this point, right? Yeah. All that's necessary because you don't have a blueprint to work from. Refactoring code is different because the code itself is telling a computer, which is objectively a very stupid thing, how to do what you're trying to get it to do, and the code communicates that just as well to a competent developer. So you don't need to interrupt. You don't need to take time away from your existing team, and that's part of the investment. The flip side of that too is it's not an all or nothing thing. There aren't a lot of big rewrites usually in a well-run refactoring campaign. It is take the most important thing, the most urgent thing, the biggest value, and do that, and do the next thing. And if you decide that your things are good enough and you want to pause for a while, you can. If you decide that you really want to make things better, and we or somebody else have proven that we're delivering that value, it's just go and ask for the budget. Because asking for budget without interrupting everything else that's going on is a lot easier than saying we're going to stop everything else that's going on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that we've tried to lean on here, just because, again, we've had a lot of these discussions with engineering managers and we're beginning to understand what they need and what they want. We believe strongly in this whole idea of incremental refactoring, right? People tend to consider refactoring as a kind of this all or nothing thing. We have to take our entire code base and refactor it. It's generally not true. Kevin's points are very well made, right? The idea of taking something that already exists and taking a slice of that code and just refactoring that increment, and then going from there. That's how we help people move along.
It's more of a risk-free kind of an engagement that way. You're
Yeah.
not, you're. I think we used the phrase one time, choosing your own adventure. That kind of an approach, right?
Yeah. Yep. Fixed cost, fixed time, predefined goal.
Yeah.
Makes things much simpler.
Yeah.
And I want to jump in here and say something that's important, and as a theme I'll get to, I think, a little later. It's part of the abstractness of refactoring also stems from not having clear goals and clear
Absolutely.
end states in mind and defining that value. And that's really where a lot of the communication breaks down. An engineering manager might say, hey, look, we had this bug in production. We wouldn't have had that if we had done that cleanup I said we should do 6 months ago, but you didn't let me do it. That conversation starts to become frayed, and it's not clear why these things need to happen and what their set endpoints are. And that's part of it is making that communication and that conversation better for both sides.
Right, and that actually leads to my next question, which is around, right, you're an engineering manager, you've got a lot of pressure on you, but how do you describe what refactoring is to a non-technical stakeholder? Because that's where this communication situation is coming up, I assume, right?
It is. Look, this is a lot. It's the old school empathy situation, right? We discussed at the beginning that there are certain priorities that the business side has. It's understanding the context that you're in and the priorities that the business side has and describing this to them in those terms. Most of the technical aspects don't need to be covered. It is an issue of, hey, listen, we definitely have an issue with retention and recruiting, or will have an issue with retention and recruiting, so we're doing X. We need to reduce the cost of development, so we're doing X. In order to increase release velocity, we're doing X. It is just always best to start with what's important to them.
I would add on top of that, because it's totally correct. I would say in the technical world, there tends to be sort of this view that the non-technical people won't understand what you're saying. But they understand that something was put together at the last minute. They understand something that is error prone. They understand that there's a difference between doing it right and getting it out the door. Like, the problem, I think, in a lot of cases is more one of trust. So you're the technical engineering manager. Presumably you're there because the person that isn't technical doesn't know what you know. So the conversation has to be, over years of working with people, has to be managed in a way that engenders trust and doesn't turn into a always pushing back on the business kind of situation, which I've seen in many, I came from the finance world, and it winds up being that way in many cases. Because if your immediate response is to push back and say, hey, we need to go back and fix these things, if that's always your response, then your role is pushing back against business, and that doesn't get them to trust you very much.
Right.
So it's about improving that situation, being clear about priorities and what needs to be fixed versus what the business needs to continue growing and continue generating revenue and working together. And as part of that, not to toot our own horn or anybody else outside company's horn, if, we have to be practical with what we tell you. Because if we come in and say, you know what, we looked at this for a day and decided you need to rewrite everything, you're going to say thanks and escort us out of the building.
Right.
Like, we need to be realistic about what's feasible, what you really need. And guess what? If you bring us in and we're telling you roughly the same things that your internal team is telling you, you should probably do it.
Yeah.
And that's part of why you bring in a third party to get another set of eyes on it.
Right. So taking that pragmatic approach to it, right? So, that same non-technical person. I mean, you're talking to the same. How do you justify the value of refactoring to them? What's at stake for them if you don't do this refactoring?
One of the nice things about how we have structured the refactory offering, the Touchlab Refactory offering, is that when we've signed the contract, when we're beginning the project, again, it's a fixed cost and a fixed time frame, but it is a fixed outcome. We have come to a place where we've agreed on what the goal is and what it is that needs to be accomplished. As a result, defining the ROI is just matching up to what the desired outcome was, right? Again, if we're talking about recruitment, now there's a larger pool of candidates, right? If it's increasing the release velocity, that's measurable, right? If it's a reduction in costs, that's also measurable based on person hours or head count or whatever is going to be saved, right? So having that defined goal allows for easily measured metrics.
We've managed to get all the way through this so far and not even mention the fact that we're focused on single code base instead of duplicate code bases, right? Having multiple code bases doing the same thing that needs to be tested and maintained, and maintenance is the cost, right? I mean, yes, the original development is obviously expensive, but years down the road when you're changing things, when you're updating things, like there's an immense cost involved, especially if you're doing it in 2 or more separate code bases where the teams interact at a feature level and not really an architectural level, certainly not a code level. So just adding that alone, I think, doesn't even really need to be discussed in detail. Obviously, less code, as long as you're not introducing more inefficiencies to get there, is a valuable proposition. And then everything else Jeff said.
So, finishing off, what's the best way then to measure the ROI of a refactoring project? What are some of the metrics, I guess? Maybe that's a better way to say it, to determine what our ROI is.
That is difficult because it is, again, abstract and it's not necessarily tied to a revenue number. I can't say that if your architecture is better, you're going to have 20% revenue increase. That's something that's just not possible. And it's also difficult to say, well, you had 10% fewer bugs this year. That was obviously entirely due to our efforts to clean up your code base. It's more of a qualitative assessment, and it's part of understanding that your technical people are experienced and competent and trusting what they have to say, that we need to fix this part of the code base because it's not tested. It produced errors last time. On our last release cycle, we had a major feature that didn't operate the same way across platforms, and that generated a lot of bad reviews. There are external metrics you can look at for sure. You can look at review velocity and how that changes over time. You can definitely get qualitative metrics on your bug reports and crashes and all that kind of stuff. But it's also tied into more qualitative assessments, and that's where it becomes abstract. But doesn't mean it's not important. It's just how do you explain that?
Any parting thoughts? Anything you want to make sure we cover off here?
Underlying the way I look at it, and not that Jeff and I look at things different ways, I think we just focus on different aspects of the same message. For me, it's a far more technical message, and it's a reduction of risk. You're not making any big decisions here. You can try things out without a big investment. You can do as little or as much as you want over time, depending on how much budget you can scrape together, right? And doing a little bit is helpful. You're not rewriting a whole bunch of stuff. So it's about that, and it's about de-risking the future, right? Like 10 years ago, Chrome was new, and nobody was going to have native apps everywhere for a decade, and then and who knows what's going to happen in another 10 years, right? So that's kind of why the other dimension of this, outside of just refactoring, is also getting onto a more portable code base to not have to worry so much about the future. So it's a lot of different stuff mixed in there.
Right.
And then, again, to highlight, if you are an engineering manager, recruiting is difficult. You want to be doing the new stuff. Your people want to be challenged. They want new things, and that's all. It's all kind of part of it. So if you're dealing with code that was old 5 years ago, they're not super excited to maintain that code, and that is going to be a problem, and it gets worse as time goes on.
Right, right. Because well, thank you very much, Kevin and Jeff, for taking some time to talk with us today. And for people that are listening, if you have any questions or would like to know more about the Touchlab Refactory, please email us by clicking on the link below. Thanks for listening.